Hi, everyone. Today, our focus is on the grammar of spoken discourse, which, as we'll see, can be quite distinct from that of written discourse. When thinking about the characteristics of spoken grammar, one that might come to mind is phrasal verbs. Statements like, we won't put up with that, or please sort out the problem, have a distinctly informal, conversational feel to them. And we can contrast these with their Latinate equivalents, like, we won't tolerate that, and please resolve the problem. But how common are phrasal verbs in spoken discourse? A corpus study by Liu 2011 investigated the frequencies of phrasal verbs across various registers, including conversation and academic discourse. She concluded, not surprisingly, that phrasal verbs are used most often in conversation, and they're considerably less common in academic prose. But which phrasal verbs are especially common in conversation? Here are 13 phrasal verbs that Lou identifies in her corpus. 10 of these are the most common verbs in conversation. 3 of them are less common. Can you identify the 3 phrasal verbs that are less frequent in conversation? You may be surprised to see that the action verbs stand up, sit down, and look up are not as common in conversation as the others. However, Lou found that these 3 verbs were especially common in fiction. And if we think about it, this makes sense. As Lou points out, describing human actions is an important part of fiction because, well, the reader's not there to see these actions. Now, of the phrasal verbs most common in conversation, here are their comparative frequencies. Any surprises? One reason these are so frequent is that they have multiple meanings, often literal and idiomatic. And in contrast, here are the top 10 most common phrasal verbs in academic texts. As you can see, the reporting verb point out, as in Liu 2011 points out that there are a few common phrasal verbs in academic discourse, is much more frequent than the others. Okay, so much for phrasal verbs. For the remainder of the video, we will look at a number of other lesser known features of spoken grammar. Let's turn to the second feature on this list: ellipses, minimal response forms. Now let's start with an example. This family is returning from a trip, and the mother says, "What a great trip!" To which the father replies, "Indeed." And the little boy says, "Yeah." So you can see there are 2 minimal response forms, indeed and yeah. And these are not formulated in isolation, but across conversational turns involving multiple discourse participants. Carter and McCarthy describe these forms as operating across turn boundaries. They are the freestanding small words that function as response tokens, such as fine, great, absolutely, definitely, indeed. And why are these minimal response forms a feature of conversation? Well, one reason is that it's not easy to formulate rich, elaborate responses in real time conversation. And so they reflect the real time production pressures of conversation. So, what are the most common minimal response forms? Here, I'll show the most common response forms in American and British English conversation. And this is from Biber and his colleagues' research. Any guesses which might be more common across the dialects? And here we are. So, yeah, it is very common across both American and British dialects. Now, the use of minimal response forms in place of full responses is probably not surprising, but what you may not know is that in conversation, some specific grammatical items may also be ellipsed, and these include pronouns and auxiliary elements. Imagine the following situation where a couple is dealing with a problem at home. See if you can identify the ellipsed elements. You still not found your phone? Yeah, found it. Then what you looking for now? Can't find my glasses. So what grammatical elements are missing here? You can see that the auxiliary element have, which is needed to form the present perfect, is dropped. We can also see the auxiliary be verb, are, needed to form the progressive aspect, is ellipsed, as well as the pronoun I. And of course, these elements are dropped because there's a shared understanding of them among the discourse participants. So, this is a kind of situational ellipses, which refers to shared understandings based on the immediate situation of items normally considered obligatory in the grammar, but not occurring on the spoken or written record. So, this points to a fundamental difference between spoken and written registers. But as you can see, while grammatical elements are dropped, the word order remains the same. So, this points to a fundamental difference between spoken and written registers. But as you can see, while grammatical elements are dropped, the word order remains the same. As you know, word order in English is known to be much more rigid and fixed than in other languages like German and Japanese. So you may be surprised to know that in spoken discourse, even the word order can be fluid and flexible. So for our fourth feature, we'll look at flexible word order, focusing on what's called headers and tails. Here, two college students are talking in a coffee shop, and one says, "My friend is taking 12 courses this semester." This is a perfectly fine utterance, but what often occurs in real world spoken discourse is something like this: "My friend, she's taking 12 courses this semester." In this instance, the element my friend is offset from the clause as a kind of adverbial or noun phrase adjunct, followed by the pronoun she. This is called a header, and it functions to highlight or draw listeners' attention to particular information. In this case, my friend. A natural response by the man might be, "She must be busy." But what often occurs in speech is this: "She must be busy, your friend." This is called a tail because, unlike headers, tails occur at the end of utterances. So, up to now, we've seen how grammatical elements are removed or reordered vis a vis headers and tails, like these examples. But in spoken discourse, we see other additional bits inserted into utterances. An especially common type of insert is discourse markers. Here are two friends talking after taking a test. "So, how was the test?" And the man responds, rather evasively, "You know, it was a test." And the woman probes further, "I mean, did you pass?" To which the man responds, "Well, we'll have to wait and see." You'll note the discourse markers in blue: well, you know, so, and I mean. Of course, you also see discourse markers in academic texts like however, therefore, and moreover. But such logical connectors are quite different from the ones we see here. So, what are the most common discourse markers in conversation? Here are the comparative frequencies of the most common discourse markers in English conversation: American in blue and British in red. So there's some difference in use across the varieties, but well is especially common across both. Biber explains that well is a versatile discourse marker, but appears to have the general function of a deliberation signal, indicating the speaker's need to give brief thought or consideration to the point at issue, which we can see in the previous example. One pattern that is also very common in spoken conversation couples together two discourse markers, so and so yeah. Let's look at an example. Here again are our university student friends. They've now received their test results, and the man says, "So I totally failed the test. The professor said my essay response was off topic and incomplete. I guess I misunderstood the test questions. So, yeah, I'll need to repeat the course next semester." As you can see, the so here is not a cause effect conjunction. Its function here is to introduce a topic, the man's test results, and the so yeah at the end functions to conclude the topic. That is, he needs to repeat the course. Another common type of insert is what's called hesitators. These are rather self explanatory. Hesitators are pause fillers, whose main function is to enable the speaker to hesitate, i.e., to pause in the middle of a message, while signaling the wish to continue speaking. Here's an example. So, what shall we have for the main course? We could have pizza. Here are the comparative frequencies of the most common hesitators in English conversation: American in blue and British in red. Some interesting findings. It seems American speakers of English prefer and British speakers. Our next feature is very common in spoken discourse, and it's called vague language. Let's look at an example. Here, a husband and wife are shopping for their teenage son. The mother asks, "How about this?" To which the father replies, "I don't think he likes that sort of thing." "Okay, how about socks or something?" These two bits of language, that sort of thing and or something, are especially common instances of vague language. So, why is vague language used in conversational discourse? According to Carter and McCarthy, vague language softens interpersonal discourse. And by using it, we are communicating to the listener that he or she will be able to fill in the missing information that is only vaguely referred to. So, as Lynn puts it, vague language indicates assumed or shared knowledge and marks in group membership. In other words, it shows an interpersonal connection between the speaker and listener, and they're connected by their shared background knowledge. The next feature is an interesting one and involves speakers actually working together to jointly construct grammar. This is referred to as grammatical co-construction across turns. Here's an example of two friends talking in a library. "Hi, Mark, you're studying hard." "Because I don't want to fail English." This interaction seems pretty normal, but what's interesting about it is that the two speakers are actually collaborating to produce grammatical utterances. The first speaker supplies the independent clause, "you're studying hard," while Mark, the second speaker, provides the subordinate clause, "because I don't want to fail English." And we can see this again in the next turn. But the course is not that hard. Here, the speaker contributes a coordinating clause joined by the conjunction but. So, while the speakers might not be aligned in the content of their assertions, from a grammatical perspective, they are very cooperative discourse participants. They work collaboratively to construct the grammar of the unfolding dialogue. And apparently, such grammatical cooperation is common. According to Carter and McCarthy, in conversational data, we find plentiful evidence of coordinated clauses and combinations of main and subordinate clauses created by more than one speaker. Okay, let's move on to feature 8, which is chunks and clusters. This is a very important feature of spoken grammar. According to McCarthy and O'Keefe, much of our language output comes in ready-made chunks, mostly consisting of between 2 and 4 or 5 words. And as Carter and McCarthy explain, These chunks are also referred to as lexical bundles, multi-word units, or clusters, as opposed to open syntactic slots. What does that mean? This couple has just left a movie theater, and the man says, "What do you think of the movie?" To which the woman replies, "Great. One of the things I really liked about it was the ending." If we take this phrase, "one of the things," and break it down syntactically, we have a determiner, a preposition, another determiner, and a noun. And we can represent this phrase in a syntactic diagram like this. Now, looking at this diagram, we can imagine substituting each of the words with others from the same grammatical category. We could say 5 of the things, 10 of the giraffes, and so on, with a nearly infinite number of possibilities. This is what's meant by open syntactic slots. But when looking at samples of spoken discourse from corpus studies, these slots are actually not so open. There tends to be a few set patterns that occur with regularity, like, for example, one of the things. These commonly occurring patterns are like frozen chunks of language that speakers regularly and fluently produce. And these frozen chunks are very common. According to one study, chunks make up more than 50% of a spoken text. So, building students' fluent use of such chunks should be a priority for teachers. But what are these chunks? Shin and Nation 2009 investigated the most common chunks or collocations for young learners, and they created a list of the 50 most useful collocations for elementary learners. And here's the list. Perhaps some teachers of young learners may find this list of use when designing input tasks for their students. Our last two features we will look at in this video go beyond little bits of language to look at larger discourse patterns in spoken interaction. The first is initiation, response, feedback, or IRF for short. Actually, this is such a ubiquitous pattern, especially in schools. It doesn't need to be taught at all. In fact, one of the common critiques of teachers' lessons is that they tend to overuse this pattern. Here's an example. The teacher says, "What is the capital city of Canada?" To which a student responds, "Ottawa." And the teacher says, "Yes, Marty, that's correct." So the first move is the initiation, followed by the response, and finally the feedback from the teacher. In short, IRF. You can see that this is a rather formulaic, mechanical interaction. Of course, there's nothing wrong with this in principle, but it should be accompanied by more meaningful, open ended questions that encourage students to think, reflect, or connect their experiences to the subject matter. Now, our last pattern we will look at is very different from the IRF in that it is not overused, but rather it's underused in many EFL classrooms. It is the question, short answer, extra information, or QSAEI for short, which is from Nation 2013. Let's look at an example. Two colleagues return to the office after a holiday, and one asks, "How was your summer break?" To which the other responds, "It was great." And he adds, "I stayed home and relaxed the whole time, so I feel really refreshed." Okay, so here we have the question, the short answer, and the extra information. This pattern can be useful to encourage students to elaborate their answers and keep the conversation going. So these are the spoken grammar features we've looked at. In closing, I hope at least 3 things are clear from this video. First, important differences exist between written and spoken grammar. Second, grammatical choices are mediated by interpersonal considerations and the situational context. Third, it may be worthwhile focusing on features of spoken grammar when teaching conversation. Here are my references. In creating this video, I've relied mostly on the major classic works in spoken grammar. However, there are two other important recent works I would like to draw your attention to. They are these two books. Both are co-authored or authored by Christian Jones from the University of Liverpool in the UK. They treat spoken grammar in much more depth than I have here, and much of the educational research, especially in the first book on the left on conversation strategies and communicative competence, is actually carried out here in the Japanese EFL context. So, for those of you who wish to pursue this area further, these are essential resources. That's all for today. Thank you for watching.